There you see Kim Jong Un and South Korea's Moon Jae-in paving the way for this week's summit. They are the two leaders with the most to gain and the most to lose this week. North Korea hopes for the kind of prosperity they see in the South. South Korea fears catastrophe if war breaks out. Martha Raddatz traveled there this week for a closer look at what's at stake.
It has been 6 months since we've taken this 1-hour drive from South Korea's capital beyond the guard towers, the barbed wire barriers that divide this once unified nation roughly in half. And there it is, North Korea. From this observation tower along the 160-mile-long, 2.5-mile-wide demilitarized zone, the view of the north is breathtaking. Last time I was at this observation point where you can look right over there, it was a time of great tension, great fear for South Koreans that somehow they were on the verge of war. This time, it just feels very different. Young children explore the grounds. Families peer through binoculars to get a closer look at the neighboring country in which the South is still technically at war. This father tells us that with the approaching summit and possible peace, he wanted his children to see North Korea with their own eyes after months of threats and fears of military conflict, a potential catastrophe for which the U.S. military had to constantly prepare. From the land. So a hardened bunker, this is serious stuff.
Yes, ma'am.
To the sea. To the sky.
So how far are we from North Korea right now?
Right now, 10 miles.
And that's as close as you can get?
That's as close as we can absolutely go.
But the military threat seems like the distant past. The harsh words, yesterday's story. Flash forward to today. Did you ever imagine during the period when President Trump was calling Kim Jong Un Little Rocket Man or comparing the sizes of nuclear buttons that we'd be where we are now?
No, actually, it's it's a big surprise.
Kenneth Choi is the chief editor of one of South Korea's major newspapers.
And now the real question is will the North Korea really go through this denuclearization process?
It is an impossible question to answer yet, but Professor John Delury, who has taught in Seoul for 8 years, says these past few months watching Kim Jong Un on the world stage, a brutal dictator, have been eye-opening.
We know so much more based on the last 6 months about Kim Jong Un, what makes him tick, what he really wants, than we did in the previous 6 years. We would be fools if we weren't reevaluating our understanding of him.
And for the young people of South Korea who have never known a unified Korean peninsula, they see an opportunity with this summit as well.
I have high hopes for the summit because Kim initiated it. As you know, Kim reached out to the South. Kim crossed the border. Kim asked for taking a picture together with President Moon. I think it's because he seeks to gain legitimacy.
Tell me what you learned growing up or in school, particularly about reunification.
Well, when I was in the elementary school, there was a song called Unification is Our Hope, or like our dream is reunification in Korean Peninsula.
And Martha's back here on set along with Jonathan Chang, the Seoul bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal. Also want to bring in Bob Woodruff, who's in Seoul today, and give us a sense, Bob, of what the mood is like there as we head into this summit.
Good morning, George. Well, the mood is pretty good right now. There are some doubters out here, that is true. But as you heard from those young people with Martha, most told me they are excited that this summit is taking place. No dangerous downside, they say. They have been living with this conflict for 65 years. They all admit Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump are equally unpredictable, but they do not believe that shaking hands and talking in Singapore could make it any worse. Probably better. So last night, we took to the streets here in Seoul, where a few hundred people marched in the rain right in front of the U.S. Embassy. And this is what they want. First, they want the Korean War to be declared over. It ended in 1953, but not officially. No peace agreement. What they want is a signed treaty. Second, they want North Korea to denuclearize, to dismantle all of its nukes, not just the long-range missiles that could reach the U.S., all of it, including those that could hit South Korea, Japan, and any other country in the region. And no one wants the resolution more than South Korea's President Moon Jae-in, who's worked hard to bring Trump and Kim together. But we have to remember that Korean cultures have more patience than ours. People here in Seoul don't expect a quick solution. This summit, they believe, is the beginning of something that they just never expected. George?
Okay, Bob, we'll come back to you later this week. John, I want to pick up on a point that Bob made right at the end there. We've talked a lot about Kim Jong Un. We've talked a lot about Donald Trump. Moon Jae-in really drove this process.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he was elected, came into office last year in May. And think about the context back then. We were having missile tests from the North Koreans. You had fire and fury just a couple of weeks later. That was really the context in which he came to office in South Korea. Now, he's been pushing for and advocating dialogue with North Korea for a long time. But that was a tough sell back in that environment because it didn't look like talks were anywhere near.
And how much of it was fear, and fear on two different fronts? Fear that President Trump would take military action if it came to that. Also the fear that he had talked about at times of pulling U.S. troops out.
Right. Well, I think certainly around August, September last year, if you can bring yourself back then, I think there was genuine concern in Seoul, in South Korea, that there might be some sort of a military option. We saw that even earlier this year with the talk of a bloody nose. And throughout the campaign and even coming into his presidency, Donald Trump has talked a lot about why do we have all of these 28,500 U.S. troops in South Korea anyways? What do we need all this for? And so he managed to, I think, concern people on the left who don't want a war and people on the right who don't want the U.S. presence to be gone either. So I think what Donald Trump has done with a lot of his rhetoric, I think, is he's really concerned people on both ends of the political spectrum. And really what you had to see with Moon last year was him moving to the center to talk, look, we need to be tough on North Korea. But when we saw Kim Jong Un earlier this year in his New Year's address say, I might be open to talks, then Moon Jae-in at that point was able to snap into action and really go back to, I think, what was his natural position, which is let's get talks going.
And Martha, it also focused the minds as if they needed any more focusing of the United States military leaders on the Korean Peninsula.
And boy, you saw those images, and I remember so well going to those exercises, being up in that fighter jet, listening to the U.S. military, and how serious this was, how deadly serious this was. They were holding secret meetings all the time, updating plans, what would happen if North Korea responded, if we attacked first, if we had to attack first, if the U.S. felt threatened, and you heard Donald Trump talk about that a lot, if they aimed missiles at Guam, remember that. They were planning for this, and if something happened, they knew that the U.S., not just South Korea, the U.S. would take a lot of casualties right away.
And they wanted to do everything they could to avoid that. On the opposite side, Jonathan, you know, we've seen such prosperity across South Korea, in Seoul. How much of an impact does that have? I mean, it's so hard to know. Do you think that any of that bleeds through to North Koreans? Do they know what's going on in South Korea?
Well, we do know that increasingly, because of the power of technology with USB thumb drives, with the internet, with even cellular telephone communication over the border with people in China, that they are increasingly aware of what life is like in South Korea. And that really forces a stark choice. I mean, Kim Jong Un, part of what comes part and parcel with these talks is the possibility of opening up. And that's a real question that you don't hear addressed so much, which is, can the North Korean system as it currently exists, could it absorb the influx of information even more freely?
And could the regime survive that kind of absorption?
That's right.
And unification, is that something even worth talking about? Or is it just so far into the future that it's not conceivable?
Well, in both Koreas, you hear unification talked about as the ultimate goal, and you hear that under conservative and liberal presidencies in South Korea. But increasingly, there's a sense that it's more lip service than anything. You have a generation now that once Moon Jae-in's generation, you know, passes out of power here, you're going to have people who truly have no recollection whatsoever of what a unified Korea is like.
I asked some of those kids who I talked to, tell me about what your parents have told you about the war. Tell me what your grandparents, and they all said, you know, in that way that my grandmother said this and that, but he's exactly right. It's just ancient history to them.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.